Understand what medieval junk food was, we must first establish what we mean by junk food in a medieval context. In the modern world, junk food typically refers to food that is convenient, quick to obtain, high in calories, low in nutritional value, and often sold by vendors or fast food establishments rather than prepared at home. Medieval junk food shared some of these characteristics, though the specifics were quite different from what we know today. Medieval cities and towns had street vendors who sold prepared food to people who were working, traveling, or simply did not want to cook at home. These vendors occupied a similar niche to modern fast food restaurants, providing quick, convenient meals to customers who were on the go. However, the types of food available, the methods of preparation, the hygiene standards, and the overall experience of purchasing and consuming this food were vastly different from anything a modern person would recognize. Let us begin by examining the most common types of medieval street food, starting with the simplest and most basic items and working our way toward more elaborate offerings. We will explore how these foods were prepared, how they were sold, what they tasted like, and what the experience of purchasing and eating them would have been like for a medieval person. We will also consider the social and economic context of street food, including who sold it, who bought it, and varying medieval urban life. The most basic form of medieval junk food was bread. Bread was the staple food medieval Europe consumed by people of all social classes at every meal. However, not all bread was the same, and the bread sold by street vendors was typically of lower quality than bread baked at home or purchased from established bakeries. Street vendors might sell small loaves or rolls of bread made from cheaper grains like barley or rye rather than expensive wheat. This bread would be dense and heavy, with a coarse texture and a somewhat sour taste from the sourdough fermentation process used to leaven it. The bread would be baked in simple ovens, often shared communal ovens where many bakers would bring their dough to be baked for a fee. The quality of the baking would be variable, depending on the skill of the baker and the condition of the oven. Some loaves would be perfectly baked, with a crisp crust and a soft interior. Others would be undercooked, with a doughy center, or overcooked, with a burnt crust and a dried-out interior. The bread sold by street vendors would typically be yesterday's bread or even older, as fresh bread would command a higher price and would be sold through more established channels. Eating this street vendor bread would be a quite different experience from eating modern bread. The texture would be much coarser and denser than modern bread, which is typically made with refined flour, and modern leavening agents that produce a light, fluffy texture. Medieval bread would be heavy and would require significant chewing. The crust would be thick and hard, sometimes almost impossible to bite through without softening it, first by dipping it in liquid or by gnawing at it repeatedly. The flavor would be quite bland by modern standards, as medieval bread was typically made with just flour, water, salt, and the sourdough starter. There would be no added fats, like butter or oil, no milk, no eggs, no sugar or honey. The taste would be predominantly of the grain itself, with a slightly sour note from the fermentation. If the bread had been sitting for a day or more, it would be stale, which would make it even drier and harder. Medieval people were accustomed to eating stale bread, and had various techniques for making it more palatable, such as toasting it over a fire or soaking it in soup or ale. Street vendors would sell bread from baskets or from simple stalls set up along busy streets or in market squares. The bread would be displayed openly, exposed to dust, flies, and the handling of many potential customers who might pick up loaves to examine them before deciding whether to purchase. There would be no wrapping or packaging. Once you purchased a loaf, you would simply take it in your hands and eat it as you walked, or you would tuck it under your arm or into a bag to carry it to your destination. The price of bread would vary depending on the size of the loaf, the quality of the grain used, and market conditions. In times of shortage, when grain was scarce, bread prices would rise dramatically, and the poor might struggle to afford even the cheapest bread. In times of abundance, after a good harvest, prices would fall, and bread would be more affordable. The price was also regulated in many medieval towns and cities through laws like the assize of bread, which attempted to ensure that bakers sold bread at fair prices and in proper weights. A typical small loaf or roll might cost a farthing, or a halfpenny, which would be a significant portion of a laborer's daily wages. This meant that even the simplest street food was not particularly cheap, and people needed to think carefully about whether to spend their money on prepared food or to make do with whatever provisions they had at home or brought with them. Beyond simple bread, street vendors sold various items that could be eaten with bread or that used bread as a base. One common offering was cheese. Street vendors would sell chunks of hard-aged cheese cut from larger wheels. This cheese would be quite different from modern cheese, particularly the mild, soft cheeses that are popular today. Medieval cheese was typically made from sheep or goat milk rather than cow milk, and it was aged for months or even years until it became very hard and developed a strong, pungent flavor. The cheese would be very salty, as salt was the primary preservative used to keep cheese from spoiling. It would have a crumbly texture that would break apart when you bit into it. The flavor would be intense and somewhat sharp, quite different from the mild cheddar or mozzarella that modern people are accustomed to. Some people would find the taste too strong or even unpleasant, but medieval people were used to these strong flavors and would not have found them objectionable. The cheese would be sold by weight, cut from pebble, a large wheel using a knife or wire. The vendor would place the cheese on a simple balance scale and add or remove small pieces until the desired weight was reached. You would specify how much you wanted, and the vendor would cut accordingly and then tell you the price. The cheese would be handed to you unwrapped, and you would need to carry it in your own container or simply in your hands. Eating bread and cheese together was a common meal for medieval people, whether at home or purchased from street vendors. You would break off a piece of bread, break off a piece of cheese, and eat them together, the bland bread balancing the strong cheese. This was a simple, filling meal that required no preparation beyond cutting and could be eaten while walking or working. It was the medieval equivalent of grabbing a sandwich from a convenience store. Pies were another common form of medieval street food, and they deserve extensive discussion as they were quite different from modern pies and represented a more elaborate form of prepared food. Medieval pies came in many varieties, but the pies sold by street vendors were typically small, handheld items that could be eaten without utensils. These were the ancestors of modern hand pies, pasties, and empanadas. The pie crust was made from a simple dough of flour, water, and perhaps some fat like lard. The dough would be rolled out and formed into a container to hold the filling. Medieval pie crust was not meant to be eaten in the same way modern pie crust is. It was often quite thick and hard, serving more as a cooking vessel and storage container than as an integral part of the dish. In fact, the crust was sometimes called a coffin, not in the sense of a burial container, but deriving from the same root word, meaning a box or basket. The filling of a street vendor's pie might consist of various ingredients depending on what was available and affordable. Meat pies were popular, filled with chopped or minced meat from burnt various sources. This might be pork, mutton, beef, or poultry, though the burnt quality of the meat would often be questionable. Street vendors needed to keep costs low to make a profit, so they would use the cheapest cuts of meat available, including scraps and organ meats that would not be sold for other purposes. The meat would be seasoned with salt and perhaps some herbs or spices if the vendor could afford them. However, expensive spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves would be used sparingly if at all in street vendor pies. More commonly, the seasoning would be limited to salt, onions, garlic, and perhaps some locally available herbs like parsley or sage. The meat would be chopped into small pieces and mixed with the seasonings, then packed into the pie crust. The pies would be baked in ovens until the crust was hard and the filling was cooked. Once baked, the pies could be kept for several days without refrigeration, as the hard crust sealed in the filling and helped preserve it. Street vendors would bake batches of pies and then sell them over the course of several days, keeping them in baskets or on simple shelves. The pies would be sold at room temperature, or might be warmed slightly over a brazier if the vendor had one. Buying a pie from a street vendor would involve approaching the vendor's stall or cart and examining the pies available. The pies would typically be small, perhaps the size of your hand, designed to be eaten as a complete meal by one person. You would select a pie, pay the vendor, and receive the pie directly in your hands. There would be no plate, no napkin, no wrapper. You would simply hold the pie and bite into it. The experience of eating a medieval street vendor pie would be quite different from eating a modern pie. The crust would be very hard and thick, almost like hard biscuit or hardtack. You would need strong teeth and jaws to bite through it. Once you managed to break through the crust, you would reach the filling, which would be dense and somewhat dry compared to modern pies that might have gravy or sauce to moisten them. The meat would be chewy and would have a strong, somewhat gamey flavor. The pie might be slightly rancid, especially if it had been sitting for several days. Without refrigeration, meat would begin to spoil fairly quickly, and while cooking, would kill some bacteria. It would not prevent the gradual degradation of the meat. Medieval people were accustomed to eating meat that was not completely fresh, and they would not be particularly bothered by slight off flavors that would be unacceptable to modern palates. However, severely spoiled pies would be recognized as inedible even by medieval standards. Food safety was a constant concern with street vendor food. The lack of refrigeration, the poor understanding of diet, hygiene, the use of low-quality ingredients, and the incentive for vendors to maximize profits by cutting corners all combined to make street food potentially dangerous. Food poisoning was common, and people would regularly suffer from upset stomachs, diarrhea, and vomiting after eating food from street vendors. In severe cases, food poisoning could be fatal, though most cases would resolve after a few miserable days. Medieval authorities attempted to regulate food vendors to prevent fraud and to maintain some basic standards of quality. In London, for example, there were laws specifying what could and could not be put into pies. Vendors were prohibited from including certain types of meat that were considered unwholesome, though enforcement of these regulations was inconsistent, and many vendors ignored them when they thought they could get away with it. Inspectors might check vendors' goods randomly, and vendors who were caught selling substandard products could be fined or even placed in the pillory to be publicly shamed. Chapter 2. Hot prepared foods beyond bread, cheese, and pies. Medieval street vendors sold various hot prepared foods that were cooked on site and sold immediately. These items required more equipment and more skill to prepare than simple bread or cheese, and they represented a higher level of street food sophistication. Let us examine these hot foods in detail. One of the most common hot street foods was roasted meat. Vendors would set up braziers or small portable ovens in which charcoal or wood would burn. Over these fires, they would roast pieces of meat on spits or skewers. The meat might be chicken, pork, mutton, or other meats, cut into portions suitable for individual servings. The smoke and smell of roasting meat would waft through the streets, attracting hungry customers. The process of roasting meat on a spit required constant attention. The meat needed to be turned regularly to ensure even cooking and to prevent it from burning on one side while remaining raw on the other. A vendor or an assistant would stand by the fire, turning the spits and monitoring the cooking. This was hot, tedious work, especially in summer, as the vendor would need to stand next to a fire for hours at a time while the sun beat down. The quality of the roasted meat would vary considerably. Fresh, good quality meat roasted with skill would be quite tasty, with a smoky, charred exterior and juicy interior. However, street vendors often used cheap, tough cuts of meat that would become dry and stringy when roasted. The meat might also be somewhat old, having been held for several days before being cooked, and if the vendor was careless or distracted, the meat might be burnt on the outside while still raw in the middle, or it might be overcooked and dried out. When you purchased roasted meat from a street vendor, you would receive the meat on its skewer or spit, or it might be handed to you directly. There would be no plate or wrapping. You would hold the hot meat in your hands, which might be uncomfortable, and you would eat it while standing or walking. The meat would be greasy and your hands would become covered in fat and bits of charred meat. There would be no napkins or towelettes to clean your hands. You would simply wipe them on your clothing or lick them clean. The taste of street vendor roasted meat would be smoky and somewhat charred. The seasoning would typically be minimal, perhaps just salt, as expensive spices would not be used by street vendors, serving common customers. The meat would require substantial chewing, especially if it was from a tough cut or an older animal. Bits of gristle and connective tissue would need to be chewed extensively or simply spat out. You would need to eat carefully to avoid biting into bone, fragments, or other hard pieces. Another common hot street food was fried fish. In coastal areas and near rivers, fish vendors would fry fresh-caught fish and sell it hot from their stalls. The fish would typically be small, whole fish that could be eaten entirely, or larger fish cut into portions. The fish would be coated in a simple batter, dusted with flour, and then fried in hot fat. The fat used for frying would typically be lard rendered from pork fat or tallow, rendered from beef fat. These fats would be solid at room temperature but would melt when heated, creating the hot fat needed for frying. Vegetable oils were less common and more expensive in medieval Europe, though olive oil was used in Mediterranean regions. The quality of the frying fat would vary, and fat that had been used repeatedly would become dark, rancid, and would impart off flavors to the fish. The process of frying fish on the street required a large pan or cauldron set over a fire. The vendor would heat the fat until it was very hot, then would add the fish. The fish would sizzle and spit as it cooked, releasing steam and creating a characteristic smell that would attract customers. After a few minutes, the fish would be removed from the hot fat, allowed to drain briefly, and then sold to customers. Eating fried fish from a street vendor would be a hot, greasy experience. The fish would be served very hot, and you would need to be careful not to burn your mouth. The batter or coating would be crispy and greasy, and the fish would be served very hot, and you would need to be careful not to burn your mouth. The batter or coating would be crispy and greasy, and the fish inside would be soft and flaky. However, the grease would quickly soak through the thin coating, and the fish would become soggy as it cooled. Your hands would become covered in grease, and you would likely drip grease on your clothing as you ate. The taste would be predominantly of fish and grease, with minimal seasoning beyond salt. Fresh fish would taste relatively clean and mild, though medieval fish would likely have a stronger flavor than modern farm-raised fish, as it would be wild-caught and would not be bled or gutted immediately after catching in the way modern commercial fish is processed. If the fish was not entirely fresh, it would have a noticeably fishy or even ammonia-like smell and taste that would be quite unpleasant to modern palates but would be tolerated by medieval people accustomed to eating fish that was not perfectly fresh. Sausages were another popular street food. Medieval sausages were made by stuffing ground or chopped meat into casings made from cleaned animal intestines. The meat used for sausages was typically scraps and trimmings that could not be sold as cuts of meat, including organ meats, fat, gristle, and other less desirable parts of the animal. This meat would be chopped or ground, mixed with salt and seasonings, and then stuffed into the casings. The seasonings used in medieval sausages varied by region and by the preferences and resources of the sausage maker. Salt was always present as a preservative and flavoring. Beyond that, there might be garlic, onions, pepper if available, and various herbs. Some regional sausage varieties had distinctive spice combinations that would identify them as coming from particular areas. Street vendors would sell sausages either raw for customers to take home and cook themselves, or cooked, ready to eat immediately. Cooked sausages would be grilled over a fire or boiled in water, then sold hot. The sausages would be quite fatty, as fat was necessary to keep the sausage moist and to add flavor. The fat would drip and sizzle as the sausages cooked, creating smoke and aroma. A cooked sausage purchased from a street vendor would be very hot and greasy. You would hold it in your hands, and the heat and grease would be uncomfortable. The casing would have a slightly chewy texture, being made from intestine, and it might be tough to bite through. The interior would be dense and fatty, with a strong meat flavor and whatever seasonings had been used. The texture would be somewhat coarse and grainy, quite different from modern sausages which are typically ground to a finer consistency. The quality and safety of street vendor sausages would be highly questionable. Sausage making was an excellent way to use up meat scraps that might otherwise go to waste, and unscrupulous sausage makers might include meat that was spoiled or that came from diseased animals. Various regulations attempted to prevent this, but enforcement was difficult, and scandals involving contaminator sausages were not uncommon. Eating sausages from unknown street vendors was something of a gamble. Boiled or stewed dishes were also sold by street vendors, though these required more equipment and were more commonly found at fixed stalls rather than being carried by mobile vendors. A vendor might have a large pot set over a fire in which a pottage or stew would simmer. This would be similar to the pottage served in taverns, consisting of vegetables, grains, and perhaps some meat, all cooked together into a thick, hearty mixture. The advantage of pottage as street food was that it could be made from cheap ingredients and could feed many people from a single pot. The disadvantage was that it required a bowl and a spoon to eat, which meant customers needed to either provide their own utensils or eat at the vendor's stall, where bowls and spoons might be available. Some vendors solved this problem by serving pottage in small bread bowls, which would be edible containers that could be consumed along with the pottage. Purchasing pottage from a street vendor would involve approaching the stall and requesting a portion. The vendor would ladle the hot pottage into a bowl or bread container and hand it to you along with a spoon. You would then need to find a place to stand or sit while you ate, as eating hot liquid pottage while walking would be difficult and messy. The bowl and spoon, if they belonged to the vendor, would need to be returned after you finished eating. The taste of street vendor pottage would be similar to any other pottage, a thick, somewhat gluey mixture of vegetables and grains with a predominant flavor of whatever ingredients had been used. The quality would depend on the skill of the vendor and the quality of the ingredients. Good pottage could be quite tasty and satisfying. Poor quality pottage would be bland and watery, or might contain ingredients that were past their prime, giving it off flavors. Chapter 3. Sweets and Treats. Medieval people did enjoy sweet foods, though sugar was rare and expensive for most of the period, and the sweets available were quite different from modern candies and desserts. Let us examine the sweet street foods that would have been available from medieval vendors. Honey was the primary sweetener in medieval Europe until sugar began to be imported in larger quantities in the later medieval period. Honey was produced by beekeepers who maintained hives and harvested the honey in late summer or early autumn. The honey would be sold to merchants and vendors who would use it in various preparations or sell it directly to customers. Street vendors might sell honey cakes, which were simple baked goods made from flour, honey, and sometimes eggs and spices. These cakes would be small, flat, and quite hard, more like cookies or biscuits than modern cake. They would be sweet but would also be quite dense and would require significant chewing. The honey flavor would be strong, as medieval honey was less processed than modern honey and retained more of the flavor of the flowers from which the bees had gathered nectar. The texture of honey cakes would be dry and crumbly, and they would benefit from being dipped in ale or wine to soften them before eating. However, street vendors would not provide beverages with the cakes unless you purchased them separately. You would buy the cake, receive it in sheeting your hand, and eat it as you walked. It would be a treat, something special beyond the everyday diet of bread and pottage, but it would not be particularly enjoyable by modern standards of what sweets should be like. Nuts were another form of sweet treat, though they are not sweet in themselves. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts grew in various parts of Europe and would be gathered in autumn. Street vendors would sell roasted nuts, particularly chestnuts, which were roasted in their shells over a fire. The smell of roasting chestnuts would be distinctive and appealing, and customers would be drawn to the vendor's stall by the aroma. Roasted chestnuts would be sold by volume or by count, scooped from the roasting pan into a simple paper cone or into the customer's outstretched hands. The chestnuts would be very hot, almost too hot to handle, and you would need to toss them from hand to hand or blow on them to cool them slightly before attempting to peel them. Peeling hot roasted chestnuts was a skill that required practice, as you needed to crack the hard shell and remove the inner skin without burning your fingers. Once peeled, the chestnut meat would be soft, slightly sweet, and quite starchy, with a texture similar to a cooked potato. The flavor would be mild and nutty, pleasant but not intensely sweet or flavorful. Eating roasted chestnuts would be a slow process, as each nut needed to be individually peeled, and a handful of chestnuts might take several minutes to consume. This would make them a good snack for walking or for occupying yourself while waiting for something. Fruit was available seasonally and would be sold by street vendors when it was in season. Fresh fruit was a luxury for many people, as it could not be stored for long and was only available for a few weeks or months each year. Street vendors would sell apples, pears, cherries, plums, and other fruits depending on what grew locally and what time of year it was. The fruit sold by street vendors would typically be of lower quality than fruit sold in more formal market settings. It might be bruised, overripe, or partially spoiled. However, for people who could not afford better quality fruit, street vendor fruit would be an affordable option. The fruit would be sold by piece or by weight, and you would select individual pieces from the vendor's basket or cart, examining them to find the best quality available. Eating fresh fruit as a treat would be one of the pleasures of medieval life, at least during the brief periods when fresh fruit was available. An apple or pear would provide sweetness, moisture, and break from the monotony of bread and porridge. However, The fruit would need to be eaten carefully, as it might contain worms or rotten spots that would need to be cut away or eaten around. Medieval people were accustomed to finding such imperfections in their food and would not be particularly disturbed by them. Dried fruit was available year-round and was sold by vendors who specialized in imported goods. Figs, dates, and raisins were imported from Mediterranean regions and were expensive, luxury items. However, smaller quantities might be affordable even for people of modest means who wanted a special treat. Dried fruit was very sweet and could be stored for long periods, making it a valuable commodity. Street vendors selling dried fruit would display their wares in baskets or bowls, and customers would purchase small quantities by weight. The dried fruit would be sticky and would attract flies and dust, so it would not be particularly clean by modern standards. You would receive your purchase wrapped in paper or a leaf, or simply in your cupped hands, and you would need to carry it carefully to avoid losing any of the precious fruit. Eating dried fruit would be a slow, deliberate pleasure. Each piece would be sweet and intensely flavored, quite different from fresh fruit. Dates and figs would be chewy and would stick to your teeth. Raisins would be wrinkled and would need to be chewed thoroughly to extract all the flavor. The sweetness would be almost overwhelming, especially for people whose diet typically contained very little sugar, and even a small quantity of dried fruit would provide significant satisfaction. In the later medieval period, as sugar became more available through trade with the Middle East and Mediterranean regions, candied fruits and simple sugar confections began to appear, though these remained expensive and were primarily consumed by the wealthy. Street vendors in large, prosperous cities might sell small pieces of candied ginger, candied citrus peel, or simple sugar candies, but these would be luxury items beyond the reach of common laborers. If you were wealthy enough to purchase such items, you would find that they were intensely sweet, much sweeter than anything made with honey alone. Sugar candies would be hard and would dissolve slowly in your mouth, providing a long-lasting sweet taste. Candied fruits would be both sweet and somewhat tough, requiring chewing to break down the candied coating and reach the fruit inside. These would be special treats, saved for celebrations or given as gifts, not everyday snacks. Chapter 4. Beverages. No discussion of medieval junk food would be complete without examining the beverages that were sold by street vendors. While water was free and available from public fountains and wells, many people preferred to drink other beverages, both for their taste and because water could be contaminated and dangerous to drink. Let us examine the various drinks that could be purchased from medieval street vendors. Ale was the most common beverage sold by street vendors and in ale houses. As we have discussed in previous chapters, medieval ale was quite different from modern beer. It was unhopped, relatively low in alcohol, and would spoil quickly, needing cold to be consumed within a few days of brewing. Street vendors would purchase ale from brewers and resell it to customers by the cup. The ale would be carried in large jugs or small barrels, and the vendor would ladle or pour it into wooden pottery or metal cups for customers. The cups would be reused from one customer to the next with minimal cleaning, perhaps just a quick rinse with water. You would pay for your ale, receive a cup, drink it on the spot, and return the cup to the vendor before moving on. Alternatively, if you had your own cup or drinking vessel, you might have the vendor fill it for you, which would ensure that you were drinking from a clean container. The taste of street vendor ale would be similar to pint ale purchased anywhere else, though the pint quality might be lower if the pint vendor had purchased cheap ale or pint. If the ale had been sitting in the jug for too long and had begun to sour, it would be cloudy and somewhat sweet, with a grainy flavor and a slightly yeasty taste. The alcohol content would be low enough that you could drink several cups without becoming seriously intoxicated, though you would feel a pleasant buzz and a sense of relaxation. Wine was also sold by street vendors, though it was more expensive than ale and was typically of lower quality than wine sold in more formal settings. The pint wine might be imported from France, Spain, Italy, or other wine-producing regions, or it might be produced locally if the climate permitted grape growing. Street vendor wine would often be the cheapest, lowest quality wine available, sometimes called small wine or thin wine because it was weak and acidic. This cheap wine would be sour and harsh, quite different from the smooth, balanced wines that the wealthy might enjoy. It might be adulterated with water to stretch the supply, or it might be old wine that had partially turned to vinegar. However, even poor quality wine would find customers, as wine was associated with higher status than ale. and people might purchase it for special occasions or simply as a change from their usual ale. The wine would be served in a similar manner to ale, poured from a jug into a cup that you would drink from and return. The taste would be strongly acidic with a pronounced sourness. The wine would be red or white depending on the source, though red wine was more common, as it traveled better and was more resistant to spoilage. You would drink the wine at ambient temperature, not chilled as modern wine often is, and you might find it more palatable if mixed with water, or if sweetened with honey. Mead, which was wine made from fermented honey, was less common than ale or wine but was occasionally sold by vendors who specialized in such products. Mead was sweeter and stronger than ale and was considered a special drink associated with celebrations and feasts. Street vendor, mead would be less elaborate than mead served at formal occasions, but it would still be relatively expensive due to the cost of honey. The taste of mead would be distinctly of honey, sweet and somewhat floral depending on what flowers the bees had visited. It would be quite alcoholic, more so than ale, and drinking mead would produce a more noticeable intoxication than drinking an equivalent amount of ale. Mead was not a beverage for everyday consumption, but rather something you might purchase for a special treat or celebration. Milk was rarely sold as a beverage by street vendors as it spoiled very quickly, without refrigeration, and was most commonly consumed by children or used in cooking. However, buttermilk, which was the liquid left over after churning butter, was sometimes available. Buttermilk would be sour and thin, quite different from the thick creamy buttermilk sold in modern grocery stores. It would be an acquired taste, but it was refreshing and was believed to have health benefits. In hot weather, cool drinks were valued but were difficult to obtain. Ice and snow could be harvested in winter and stored in ice houses packed with straw or sawdust, but this was expensive and was primarily available only to the wealthy. Street vendors in large cities might occasionally sell drinks cooled with ice, but this would be a luxury beyond the reach of most people. Most drinks would be consumed at ambient temperature, which could be quite warm in summer. Various herbal drinks and tonics were sold by vendors who claimed they had medicinal properties. These might include drinks made from herbs believed to aid digestion, to cure headaches, to increase strength or virility, or to treat various ailments. The effectiveness of these drinks was questionable, as medieval understanding of medicine was based on the theory of humors and did not correspond to actual physiological processes. However, people believed in these remedies and would purchase them hoping for relief from their ailments. Chapter 5. The social context of street food. To fully understand medieval junk food, we must examine not just the food itself but the social context in which it was sold and consumed. Street food vendors occupied a particular niche in medieval urban society, and the practice of purchasing and eating street food was shaped by economic, social, and cultural factors that would be quite alien to modern sensibilities. Street food vendors were typically people of lower social status who were trying to make a living by providing food to others. They might be women who brewed ale at home and sold the surplus in the street, or they might be men who had learned a trade like sausage making or pie baking and set up as independent vendors. Some vendors were successful enough to establish permanent stalls in markets, while others were itinerant, moving from place to place carrying their goods in baskets or on carts. The authorities in medieval towns and cities attempted to regulate street vendors to maintain order, to collect taxes, and to prevent fraud and the sale of unwholesome food. Vendors might be required to obtain licenses, to pay fees for the right to sell in certain locations, and to submit to periodic inspections of their goods. However, enforcement of these regulations was often lax, and many vendors operated illegally or in a gray area between legal and illegal activity. Customers for street food came from various social classes, though the primary market was working people who needed quick, convenient meals, laborers who were working on construction projects, servants running errands for their employers, travelers who were passing through the city, apprentices and journeymen who were taking breaks from their work. All of these people might purchase food from street vendors rather than going home to eat or bringing food from home. The economics of street food were such that it was not particularly cheap compared to home-prepared food, but it was convenient. If you were working far from home and would lose valuable work time by going home to eat, purchasing a pie or some bread and cheese from a street vendor might make economic sense even though it cost more than preparing the food yourself. Similarly, if you were traveling and had no place to prepare food, purchasing from vendors would be your only option. The experience of eating street food would typically involve consuming the food while standing or walking, rather than sitting down to eat in a formal manner. This was one of the characteristics that distinguished junk food from proper meals, which were meant to be eaten while seated at a table with proper attention to the food and to dining companions. Eating while walking was considered somewhat crude and undignified, but it was practical when time was limited. Medieval cities were crowded, dirty places, and eating food in the street meant consuming it in an environment that would be shocking to modern standards of hygiene. The streets were muddy or dusty depending on the weather, filled with garbage and animal waste, and crowded with people, animals, and vehicles. Your food would be exposed to all of this, and flies would land on it immediately. You would need to eat quickly before the food became too contaminated, and you would need to accept that you were consuming some amount of dirt and filth along with your meal. The social interaction involved in purchasing street food would be quite different from modern retail transactions. There would be no fixed prices posted, no cash registers, no receipts. You would need to negotiate with the vendor, discussing what was available and what the price would be. The vendor might charge different prices to different customers based on their assessment of how much each customer could afford or how much they could get away with charging. Haggling was expected and was part of the normal process of purchasing anything in medieval markets. You would offer less than the asking price, the vendor would refuse and perhaps pretend to be insulted by your low offer. You would increase your offer slightly, the vendor would reduce their asking price slightly, and this would continue until you reached an agreement, or until one of you walked away. This process could take several minutes for even a simple purchase, and it required skill and practice to do effectively. Trust was a major issue in street food transactions. You had no way to verify the quality or freshness of the food beyond visual inspection and smell. The vendor might lie about what ingredients were in a pie or when a loaf of bread had been baked. You needed to rely on the vendor's reputation, on recommendations from others, and on your own judgment. If you were cheated, you would have little recourse beyond refusing to buy from that vendor in the future and warning others about their dishonesty. The locations where street vendors operated were important to understanding the geography and social dynamics of medieval cities. Vendors would congregate in areas with high foot traffic, particularly near city gates where travelers entered, near busy markets, and near large workplaces like construction sites or shipyards. These areas would be noisy and chaotic, with vendors calling out to advertise their wares, customers negotiating purchases, and the general sounds of urban life creating a constant din. Some vendors would move through the streets, carrying their goods and calling out to announce what they had to sell. These cries of street vendors would be distinctive and would become so familiar that residents could identify what was being sold just from the sound of the vendor's call. Hot pies, fresh fish, ale, good ale. These calls would echo through the narrow streets, competing with each other and with all the other sounds of the city. The sensory experience of medieval urban street food culture would be overwhelming. The smells of cooking food, of smoke from fires, of unwashed bodies, of animal waste, of rotting garbage, all of these would mingle together in a powerful, often unpleasant combination. The sounds would be equally overwhelming, with vendors shouting, customers arguing, animals making noise, and the general roar of urban activity. The visual scene would be crowded and chaotic, with people constantly in motion, carts and animals blocking the streets, and vendors' stalls creating obstacles. Understanding this context helps us appreciate how different the medieval street food experience would be from anything a modern person might encounter. Even in crowded, chaotic modern street food markets in developing countries, there are standards of hygiene, health inspections, and a general infrastructure that would be completely absent in medieval cities. The medieval street food experience would be raw, visceral, and often unpleasant, though medieval people would not perceive it this way, because they had never known anything different. Chapter 6. Specific regional variations. Street food was not uniform across medieval Europe, but varied by region, based on local ingredients, cooking traditions, and cultural preferences. Let us examine some specific regional variations to understand the diversity of medieval junk food. In England, one of the most characteristic street foods was the meat pie or pasty. The Cornish pasty, though the specific form we know today developed later, had medieval predecessors that were similarly structured. These were semicircular pies with crimped edges, filled with meat and vegetables. The thick, crimped edge served as a handle that could be held by workers with dirty hands, allowing them to eat the filling without contaminating it, and then discarding the handle portion that had been touched. London street vendors were famous for their eel pies. Eels were abundant in the Thames River and were an important food source for Londoners. The eels would be caught, killed, skinned, and cut into pieces, then baked into pies. Eel pie had a distinctive taste that was quite strong and would not appeal to everyone, but it was cheap and filling. The texture of eel is quite gelatinous when cooked, giving eel pie a unique consistency that some people found appealing and others found off-putting. In France, street vendors sold various forms of bread and pastries that were more elaborate than English offerings. French bakers had developed greater sophistication in their craft, and even street vendors might sell items like small brioche-like breads, though these would be simple versions without the rich butter content of later brioche. French vendors also sold various forms of sausages and prepared meats, often more heavily spiced than English equivalents. In Italy, particularly in coastal cities like Venice and Genoa, street food reflected the Mediterranean diet and the influence of trade with the East. Fish in various preparations was common, often grilled or fried, with olive oil and served with bread. Vendors might also sell rice dishes, as rice cultivation had been introduced to Italy from the Islamic world and had become an important crop in the Po Valley. These rice dishes would be simple preparations, quite different from the elaborate risottos of later periods, but they represented a form of street food that was distinctively Italian. German street vendors sold various forms of sausages that were the predecessors of modern German sausage varieties. These would be made from pork primarily, as pig farming was important in German territories, and would be seasoned with local herbs and spices. German vendors also sold pretzels, which were twisted breads that had been boiled in an alkaline solution before baking, giving them a distinctive shiny brown crust and a unique flavor. Pretzels could be made in various sizes, from small bite-sized pieces to large items that could serve as meal. In Spain, particularly in coastal areas, street vendors sold fish prepared in various ways, including fried fish, that was the ancestor of modern pescado frito. The use of olive oil for frying was more common in Spain than in northern Europe, giving the food a different flavor profile. Spanish vendors also sold various items incorporating almonds, which grew well in southern Spain and were used in both savory and sweet dishes. In the Low Countries, which comprised parts of modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, street vendors sold items incorporating dairy products, as this region was known for its cattle and dairy production. Cheese in various forms was common, as were dishes made with butter and cream. Vendors might also sell fish, as the fishing industry was important in coastal areas, and the fish would be prepared in local styles that might include pickling or smoking. Each region had distinctive characteristics in their street food that reflected local agricultural production, cultural traditions, and outside influences from trade and contact with other regions. A traveler moving from one region to another would notice these differences and might find some regional specialties appealing while finding others strange or unappetizing. The diversity of medieval European street food was one of its interesting characteristics, though. This diversity operated within the constraints imposed by the limited ingredients and cooking technologies available. Chapter 7. The Daily Rhythm of Street Food. The daily availability and consumption of street food followed daily and seasonal rhythms that structured when and how people accessed these foods. Understanding these rhythms helps us comprehend the role that street food played in medieval daily life. The day would begin early for street food vendors, often well before dawn. Bakers would need to start their fires and begin preparing dough in the early morning hours so that fresh bread would be ready. When customers wanted breakfast, vendors selling cooked foods would need to prepare their fires and begin cooking so that hot food would be available. When workers began their day, the first customers would appear at dawn, or shortly after, as people left their homes to begin work. Workers who had not eaten at home might purchase bread or a simple pastry from a vendor on their way to the workplace. This would be a quick transaction, with the customer buying food that could be eaten while walking. There would be no time for lingering or for socializing with the vendor. Mid-morning would see another surge of business as workers took breaks from their labor. Those who had started work at dawn would have been working for several hours and would be hungry. They might purchase bread and cheese, a pie, or some other simple food to give them energy to continue through the day. This mid-morning meal would be brief, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes before workers needed to return to their tasks. Midday was the traditional time for the main meal of the day in medieval culture. and many people would go home to eat with their families. However, those who were working far from home or who did not have the time to make the journey would purchase food from vendors. This midday market would be the busiest time for street food vendors, and they would need to be prepared with adequate supplies to meet demand. The types of food purchased at midday might be more substantial than what was bought earlier in the day. Workers would want a proper meal that would sustain them through the afternoon's labor. Hot pies, roasted meat, pottage, or other filling foods would be popular choices. Vendors would be busy serving customers, taking payment, and trying to prevent theft and disorder at their crowded stalls. The afternoon would see quieter business as people returned to work after eating. Some vendors might use this time to prepare additional food for the evening rush, while others might close their stalls temporarily to rest or to attend to other business. The pace of street food vending was demanding, and vendors needed to manage their energy and resources carefully to survive the planned working day. Evening would bring another increase in business as workers finished their day's labor and began making their way home. Some would purchase food to take home for supper, while others would eat street food as their evening meal before heading to taverns or alehouses for drinking and socializing. The types of food purchased in the evening might be different from midday offerings, perhaps including more ale and fewer solid foods as people transitioned from work mode to leisure mode. As darkness fell, most street vendors would close their businesses and go home. Operating after dark was difficult without adequate lighting, and it was also dangerous. As crime increased at night, only vendors who operated from fixed, well-lit stalls might continue into the evening. The streets would become quieter as vendors packed up their goods, covered their fires, and departed. The seasonal rhythm of street food would be quite pronounced. In spring, after the case of scarcity of late winter, the appearance of fresh greens and early vegetables would be welcomed, and vendors would incorporate these into their offerings. The lengthening days would mean longer business hours and more customers on the streets. Spring would be a time of renewal and increasing activity. Summer would bring peak business for street vendors. The long days, the warm weather, and the maximum amount of economic activity would all combine to create ideal conditions for street food vending. However, summer also brought challenges, including the rapid spoilage of food in the heat, the discomfort of working near fires in hot weather, and the increased presence of flies and other pests. Vendors would need to be particularly vigilant about food quality and would need to adjust their practices to account for the heat. Autumn would bring the harvest and an abundance of fresh food. This was the best time of year for street food, as ingredients were at their peak of quality and availability. The weather would be pleasant, neither too hot nor too cold. People would have money from harvest wages and would be willing to spend it on food and drink. Street vendors could make good profits in autumn if they managed their businesses well. Winter would be the most challenging season. The short days would limit business hours. The cold weather would discourage people from spending time on the streets. Food preservation would be easier due to the cold, but the types of food available would be limited to what could be stored or preserved. Many vendors would struggle to make ends meet in winter, surviving on savings from better seasons or supplementing their income with other work. Understanding these daily and seasonal rhythms helps us appreciate that medieval street food was not a constant, unchanging feature of urban life, but rather was deeply integrated into the larger patterns of work, weather, and agricultural cycles that structured all of medieval existence. Chapter 8: Food Safety and Health Concerns. The question of food safety in medieval street food is important to address, as the conditions under which food was prepared, stored, and sold were quite different from modern standards, and the health consequences could be severe. Let us examine in detail the various food safety issues that would have affected medieval street food. The most fundamental issue was the lack of refrigeration. All food would be stored at ambient temperature, which meant that perishable items would spoil quickly. Meat, fish, dairy products, and cooked foods would all be vulnerable to bacterial growth, and without understanding of microbiology, vendors would have no scientific basis for understanding why food spoiled or how to prevent it beyond common sense practices, like keeping food cool and dry. Meat and fish would begin to spoil within hours of being butchered or caught, especially in warm weather. The first signs of spoilage would be a slight off smell and perhaps some discoloration. As spoilage progressed, the smell would become stronger, the texture would become slimy, and flies would be attracted to it. Medieval vendors would attempt to mask the signs of spoilage by using strong seasonings, by washing the meat in water or vinegar, or by cooking it thoroughly. but these measures would not eliminate the harmful bacteria that had multiplied in the spoiling meat. Customers would need to use their senses to judge whether food was acceptable. They would smell meat or fish before purchasing it, looking for signs of spoilage. They would examine pies and baked goods for mold or other visible problems. They would taste ale and wine to determine if they had gone sour. However, many forms of food contamination would not be detectable by these methods, and people would regularly consume food that was contaminated with harmful bacteria. The result would be frequent cases of food poisoning. Symptoms might include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and fever. These symptoms might appear within hours of eating contaminated food, or they might take a day or more to develop. The illness would typically run its course over a few days, leaving the person weak and dehydrated. In most cases, people would recover without treatment, but in severe cases or in vulnerable individuals such as children, the elderly, or those already weakened by other illnesses, food poisoning could be fatal. Medieval people were familiar with food poisoning and would have experienced it regularly, though they might not have understood the cause. They would attribute illness to various factors including bad humors, divine punishment, or witchcraft, rather than to bacterial contamination of food. This lack of understanding meant that effective prevention was impossible, and people simply accepted that they would occasionally become ill after eating. The lack of hand washing and general hygiene practices would have contributed significantly to food safety problems. Medieval understanding of disease did not include the concept of germs, so there was no reason to wash hands before handling food beyond removing visible dirt. Vendors would handle food with unwashed hands after touching money, after scratching themselves, after handling raw meat, after doing any number of other activities that would transfer bacteria to the food. The utensils and containers used by vendors would also be sources of contamination. Knives used to cut raw meat would be wiped clean with a cloth and then used to cut bread or cooked meat without any proper washing or sanitizing. Cutting boards would accumulate bacteria in their cracks and gouges. Containers used to hold food would be reused without proper cleaning. All of these practices would create opportunities for cross-contamination and for the spread of harmful bacteria. The water used in food preparation was another source of contamination. Water would be drawn from wells, rivers, or public fountains, and this water might be contaminated with sewage, animal waste, or other pollutants. Cooking would kill some bacteria, but water used for rinsing or for mixing into uncooked items would introduce contamination. The practice of diluting ale or wine with water might actually make these beverages more dangerous rather than less dangerous if the water was contaminated. Parasites were another concern, particularly in meat. Pork might contain trichinosis, a parasitic worm that would cause severe illness if the meat was not cooked thoroughly. Beef and other meats might contain tapeworms or other parasites. Fish might contain various parasites. Thorough cooking would kill most parasites, but street vendor food might not always be cooked adequately, especially if vendors were trying to serve customers quickly and were not careful about ensuring that meat was cooked through to the center. Adulteration of food was another problem. Unscrupulous vendors might add substances to their food to increase its weight or volume, or to mask spoilage. Bread might be adulterated with chalk, sawdust, or ground beans. Ale might be watered down. Meat pies might contain scraps of spoiled meat mixed with fresh meat. These practices were illegal and were punished when detected. But detection was difficult, and penalties were often not severe enough to deter the practice. The cumulative effect of all these food safety issues was that medieval people lived with a much higher level of foodborne illness than modern people in developed countries. Stomach problems were common and were accepted as a normal part of life. People had more robust immune systems than modern people because they were constantly exposed to pathogens, but they also suffered from chronic infections and parasitic infestations that would affect their overall health and energy levels. Chapter 9. Conclusion and Reflections. As we conclude this examination of medieval junk food, let us reflect on what we have learned and on how different the medieval experience was from the modern experience of convenient, quick food. The foods themselves were quite different. The context in which they were consumed were alien to modern sensibilities, and the overall experience would be challenging and often unpleasant for a modern person. Medieval junk food shared some characteristics with modern fast food, primarily the qualities of convenience and quick availability. Just as a modern person might grab a burger or slice of pizza on the way to work or during a lunch break, a medieval person would purchase bread, a pie, or some roasted meat from a doint street vendor. to eat quickly before returning to their tasks. The functional dointlo was similar, even though the specific foods and the context were done quite different. However, the differences far outweighed the similarities. Medieval junk food was generally of poor quality, made from cheap ingredients by vendors who were trying to maximize profits. The hygiene standards were abysmal by modern measures, and food safety was constantly compromised by lack of refrigeration, poor sanitation, and limited understanding of foodborne illness. The sensory experience would be overwhelming and often unpleasant, with strong smells, loud noises, and crowded, dirty conditions. The social context was also quite different. Medieval street food was embedded in a society with rigid class hierarchies, limited social mobility, and very different values and assumptions than those that prevail in modern Western societies. The relationship between vendor and customer was shaped by these social factors in ways that would be foreign to modern commercial relationships. The hygiene between vendor and customer was shaped by these social factors in ways that would be foreign to modern commercial relationships. The economic calculations were different, as food took up a much larger portion of household budgets and purchasing street food represented a significant expenditure. For a modern person somehow transported to medieval times, the experience of purchasing and eating street food would be deeply uncomfortable. Everything would be strange. The types of food available, the way transactions were conducted, the conditions under which food was prepared and sold, the taste and texture of the food itself, the social interactions involved, and the physical environment of the medieval street. You would likely become ill from eating the food, as your immune system would not be adapted to the pathogens present. You would find the food bland or unpleasant tasting, as it would lack the complex flavors and seasonings you are accustomed to. You would be hungry after eating, as the portions would be smaller and less calorie-dense than modern fast food. You would also be struck by how much work and time were required for what we consider simple tasks. Purchasing a pie would involve locating a vendor, negotiating a price, examining the pie for quality, conducting a transaction without benefit of cash registers or fixed prices, and then consuming the pie without the benefit of napkins, plates, or seating. What would take minutes in a modern fast food restaurant would take much longer in medieval conditions. Understanding medieval junk food helps us appreciate how much progress has been made in food production, food safety, and public health. Modern fast food, while often criticized for its nutritional shortcomings, is at least safe to eat, consistent in quality, affordable, and available under hygienic conditions. Modern food regulations, refrigeration, understanding of food safety, and the infrastructure of food production and distribution all combine to make modern food far superior to medieval food in almost every measurable way. Yet there is something fascinating about imagining the medieval street food scene. The vendors calling out their wares, the smell of roasting meat wafting through the narrow streets, the bustle and chaos of the medieval city, the simple human need for convenient food being met through the ingenuity and labor of street vendors. It was a world that was harsh and uncomfortable, but it was also a world where human creativity and entrepreneurship found ways to meet basic needs despite limited resources and technology. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your clean, comfortable, modern home, perhaps after having eaten food that was safely prepared and stored under hygienic conditions, take a moment to appreciate how fortunate you are. The medieval world of junk food is fascinating to learn about, but it is not a world any modern person would want to actually experience. The bread would be too hard, the pies too questionable, the hygiene too poor, the smell too strong, and the overall experience too alien and uncomfortable. Sleep well, dear listener, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow you can purchase safe, tasty, convenient food without fear of food poisoning, without negotiating prices with suspicious vendors, and without eating in the filthy, crowded streets of a medieval city. The medieval world is safely in the past, and we can learn from it without having to endure its many hardships. Chapter 10. The equipment and tools of street vendors. To fully understand medieval street food, we must examine the equipment and tools that vendors use to prepare and sell their wares. These tools were simple by modern standards but represented significant investments for vendors and required skill to use effectively. Let us explore these implements in detail. The most basic requirement for many street food vendors was a source of heat for cooking. This meant fire and managing fire in an urban street setting. presented significant challenges. Vendors who sold cooked food would need to carry or transport braziers, which were metal containers designed to hold burning charcoal or wood. These braziers came in various sizes and designs, but all shared the basic principle of providing a contained fire that could be used for cooking while minimizing the risk of the fire spreading. A typical brazier might be made of iron or bronze, with a bowl-shaped bottom to hold the fuel and burning coals, and perhaps legs to raise it off the ground. The sides might have holes to allow air to flow through, feeding oxygen to the fire and keeping it burning hot. Some braziers had grates on top where food could be placed directly over the flames, while others had hooks or chains for hanging pots over the fire. The weight of a brazier, even when empty, would be considerable, and a vendor would need to be strong to transport it to and from their selling location each day. The fuel for these fires would typically be charcoal, which was made by burning wood in a low-oxygen environment to drive off moisture and volatile compounds, leaving behind nearly pure carbon. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than wood and produced less smoke, making it more suitable for cooking in crowded urban areas. However, charcoal was expensive, and vendors needed to calculate carefully how much fuel they would need for a day's business while keeping costs manageable. Using too little fuel might mean the fire would go out before all the food was cooked, while using too much would eat into profits. Starting and maintaining the fire required skill and attention. Vendors would typically start their fires early in the morning using tinder, kindling, and fire-starting tools like flint and steel or a tinderbox. Once the fire was established, they would need to tend it throughout the day, adding fuel as needed and adjusting the airflow to control the temperature. A fire that was too hot might burn food, while a fire that was too cool would cook food too slowly and might not fully cook the interior of thick items. Cooking implements varied depending on what the vendor was preparing. For roasting meat, iron skewers or spits would be essential. These would be long metal rods, pointed at one end to pierce the meat, with a handle at the other end for turning. The meat would be threaded onto the skewer and then positioned over or near the fire, and the vendor would need to turn it regularly to ensure even cooking. The heat from the fire and the weight of the meat would make this tiring work, especially when done for hours at a time. For frying food, a large, flat iron pan would be necessary. This pan would be set directly on the brazier or suspended over it, and fat would be melted in the pan before food was added. The pan would become very hot, and the vendor would need to be careful not to burn themselves when adding or removing food. A long-handled tool like a slotted spoon or a pair of tongs would be used to turn food and to remove it from the hot fat. The fat itself would spit and sputter as food cooked, and the vendor would need to be constantly vigilant to avoid burns. For vendors who sold pies, pottage, or other items that required baking or prolonged cooking, a portable oven or a large pot would be necessary. A portable oven might be a clay or metal box that could be heated with coals placed underneath and on top, creating an enclosed space where items could bake. A large iron pot could be suspended over the fire by a chain or tripod, and pottage or stew could be kept simmering for hours, with occasional stirring to prevent sticking or burning. The containers used for storing and displaying food were also important pieces of equipment. Baskets made from woven willow or other flexible plant materials were common for displaying bread, pies, pastries, and other dry goods. These baskets would be lined with cloth to keep the food relatively clean and to provide some cushioning. However, the cloth would rarely be washed, and it would accumulate grease, crumbs, and other debris over time, contributing to the generally unhygienic conditions. For liquids like ale or wine, vendors would use jugs, pitchers, or small barrels. These containers might be made of clay, wood, or metal, depending on what the vendor could afford. Clay jugs were cheapest, but were fragile and could break if dropped. Wooden containers were more durable, but could be difficult to clean and might harbor bacteria in cracks and seams. Metal containers were most expensive, but were durable and relatively easy to clean. All of these containers would be heavy when full, and vendors would need significant upper body strength to pour from them repeatedly throughout the day. Serving vessels were equally important. Cups for serving drinks might be made of wood, pottery, leather, or metal. Wooden cups were common and affordable, though they would warp and crack over time and would absorb liquids, leading to staining and flavor transfer. Pottery cups were more expensive but could be cleaned more thoroughly. Metal cups, made of pewter or tin, were the most expensive but were durable and had the advantage of being valuable enough that customers were unlikely to walk away with them. Plates or trenchers for serving food on were less common for street vendors, as most street food was designed to be eaten by hand, without utensils. However, vendors who sold pottage or stew might provide simple, wooden bowls for customers to eat from at the stall. These bowls would be washed between customers, though the washing would consist of a quick rinse in a bucket of water rather than thorough scrubbing with soap. The water in the wash bucket would become progressively dirtier throughout the day as bowl after bowl was rinsed in it. Knives were essential tools for many vendors. A vendor selling cheese would need a sharp knife for cutting chunks from the larger wheel. A vendor selling meat would need knives for carving cooked meat into portions. A vendor selling pies might need a knife for cutting large pies into smaller pieces. These knives would be simple, with blades made of iron or steel and handles made of wood, bone, or horn. They would be kept sharp through regular use of whetstones, and vendors would be skilled in their use through daily practice. Scales and weights were necessary for vendors who sold items by weight rather than by piece. A simple balance scale consisted of a beam with pans suspended from each end, one for the goods being sold and one for the standard weights. The vendor would place the item being sold in one pan and add known weights to the other pan until the beam balanced, indicating that the weight of the item was equal to the weight of the standards. However, scales could be tampered with, and dishonest vendors might use false weights or might adjust the balance point of the beam to cheat customers. Customers would need to be alert to such cheating and might insist on examining the weights to verify they were genuine. In some markets, there would be official inspectors who checked weights and measures periodically, and vendors caught using false weights could be fined or subjected to public punishment. However, enforcement was inconsistent, and savvy vendors would cheat when they thought they could get away with it. Carts or portable stalls were used by vendors who wanted to establish a semi-permanent selling location. A simple cart might be a wooden platform on wheels that could be pushed to the selling location and then set up with a canopy or awning to provide some protection from sun and rain. More elaborate stalls might have fold-down sides that could be opened to display goods and then closed up at the end of the day for security. Building or purchasing such equipment required capital investment, and not all vendors could afford it. The location where a vendor setup was crucial to success. Prime locations in busy markets or near city gates would attract more customers, but would also cost more in fees or bribes to secure. Vendors would compete for good locations and might arrive very early in the morning to claim their spots. Established vendors with regular locations would develop relationships with customers who knew where to find them, while itinerant vendors who moved from place to place would need to announce their presence loudly to attract attention. All of this equipment needed to be maintained, and breakage or wear of essential tools could be disastrous for a vendor. An iron pot that cracked would leak and would need to be repaired or replaced. A handle that broke off a ladle would make serving difficult. A scale that became inaccurate would lead to disputes with customers. Vendors needed to be able to perform basic maintenance and repairs themselves, or needed to know craftsmen who could do such work affordably. The investment in equipment, the daily labor of transporting it to and from the selling location, the skill required to use it effectively, and the constant need for maintenance and replacement all contributed to making street food vending a difficult, demanding occupation that required dedication and resilience to pursue successfully. Chapter 11. A Day in the Life of a Pie Vendor. To bring our understanding of medieval street food to life, let us follow a fictional pie vendor through a typical day of work. This will help us appreciate the practical realities of this occupation and will illustrate the many details we have been discussing in a concrete narrative form. Our vendor, whom we shall call William, is a man of middle years who has been selling pies in the market of a medium-sized English town for the past decade. He wakes before dawn in his small house on the edge of town where he lives with his wife, Joan, and their 3 children. The house is cold and dark, and William must fumble to light a candle from the embers still glowing in the hearth from the night before. Joan has already risen and has begun preparing the day's batch of pies. She has mixed flour with water and lard to create dough, which she has divided into portions and rolled out on a wooden board. She has prepared the filling by chopping leftover pieces of mutton and mixing them with onions, salt, and a pinch of pepper that was a precious commodity. Now she is forming the pies, placing filling on circles of dough, folding them over and crimping the edges to seal them. William tends the fire in their small oven, adding fuel and making sure the temperature is right for baking. When the fire oven is ready, Joan slides the pies in using a wooden peel, and William closes the oven door to trap the heat. The pies will need to bake for about an hour, so William and Joan take this time to eat their own breakfast of bread and weak ale and to prepare for the day ahead. While the pies bake, William loads his handcart with the equipment he will need. He places his portable brazier, a small supply of charcoal for warming pies if needed, a cloth to line his basket, a few wooden cups, a jug of ale that he has purchased from a brewer, and various other small items. He checks his purse to make sure he has small coins for making change. He wraps a thick cloth around his waist to serve as an apron and protection from the heat of the brazier. When the pies are ready, Joan removes them from the oven. They are golden brown and smell appealingly of cooked meat and pastry. She counts them carefully. She has made 24 today, which should be enough to sell, but not so many that there will be waste if business is slow. She wraps the hot pies in cloths and carefully arranges them in William's basket, placing cloth between layers to prevent them from sticking together. William lifts the heavy basket and places it on his cart, then wheels the cart out into the pre-dawn darkness. The streets are quiet at this early hour, with only a few other vendors and workers moving about. William makes his way toward the market square, the wooden wheels of his cart rumbling on the cobblestones and occasionally catching on ruts or stones. He must be careful not to jostle the cart too much, or the pies might be damaged. He arrives at the market square just as dawn is breaking. Other vendors are already setting up their stalls, and William exchanges greetings with some of them, a woman who sells bread, a man who sells cheese, another who sells fish. William has his regular spot in the market, for which he pays a weekly fee to the market officials. He positions his cart, spreads his cloth on the ground, and arranges his pies in their basket where customers can see them. The first customers arrive as the sun rises. These are workers who are beginning their shifts and want something to eat before starting work. A carpenter's apprentice purchases a pie and pays with a halfpenny. William hands him the warm pie wrapped in a scrap of cloth, and the young man bites into it eagerly as he hurries off to his master's workshop. A woman who does laundry buys 2 pies, one for herself and one for her daughter, who is helping her today. Business is steady through the morning. William calls out occasionally, "Hot pies, meat pies, good and fresh," to attract customers who might not have noticed his stall. Some customers he knows by sight or by name, regular customers who buy from him frequently. Others are strangers, perhaps travelers passing through the town. To the regulars, William is friendly and conversational. To strangers, he is polite but more reserved, watching to make sure they pay fairly and do not try to cheat him. Around mid-morning, a dispute arises. A customer complains that the pie he purchased is not fully cooked in the middle. William examines the pie and sees that the customer is correct. The center is still somewhat raw. William apologizes and offers to replace the pie with a better one. The customer accepts, and the matter is settled. William makes a mental note to tell Joan that the oven may need to be hotter, or the pies may need to bake longer. By midday, William has sold about half his pies. This is good progress, and if sales continue at this pace, he should sell out by late afternoon. He allows himself a brief rest, sitting on the edge of his cart and eating a piece of bread and cheese that Joan packed for him. He drinks some ale from his jug, careful not to drink too much as he needs to remain alert and sober. The afternoon brings more customers, including some wealthier townsfolk who are shopping in the market. A merchant's wife purchases 4 pies to take home for her family's supper. She examines the pies carefully before making her selection, and she haggles briefly over the price before agreeing to pay. William wraps the pies carefully for her and thanks her for her custom. As the day wears on and his supply diminishes, William adjusts his prices slightly, offering a better deal to encourage customers to buy the remaining pies. He knows from experience that pies left unsold today will be less appealing tomorrow, so it is better to sell them today, even at a reduced profit, than to risk having them go stale. By late afternoon, he is down to his last few pies. A group of young laborers, finished with their work for the day and in high spirits, approach William's stall. They are boisterous and have clearly been drinking. They purchase the last of William's pies and eat them right there, talking and laughing loudly. One of them jokingly accuses another of getting a bigger pie, and there is some mock fighting and shoving. William watches them carefully, ready to intervene if the situation becomes truly aggressive. But the young men settle down and eventually move on, leaving William in peace. With all his pies sold, William packs up his cart. He carefully washes his cups and jug with water from a public fountain. Though the washing is cursory, he loads everything onto his cart and begins the journey home. His body aches from standing all day, and his feet are sore. He counts the money in his purse and calculates mentally that he has made a decent profit today after accounting for the cost of ingredients and the market fee. At home, Joan is preparing the evening meal. William gives her most of the money he earned, keeping back a small amount for incidental expenses. They eat together as a family, and William tells Joan about his day, the dispute with the customer, the merchant's wife who bought 4 pies, the rowdy young laborers. Joan shares news from the neighborhood. The children are tired and are sent to bed early. Before sleeping, William, Peng, and Joan prepare for the next day. Joan begins mixing dough for tomorrow's pies. William checks his equipment and makes a note that he needs to purchase more charcoal soon. They discuss whether they should try making pork pies instead of mutton pies, as pork might be cheaper this week. They agree to visit the butcher in the morning to see what is available. Finally, William, Peng, and Joan go to bed, exhausted from the long day's work. They will sleep for a few hours before starting the cycle again. This is the rhythm of their life, day after day, week after week, month after month. It is hard work and the profits are modest, but it provides for their family, and they take some pride in their craft and in their ability to serve their community by providing convenient, affordable food to working people. This detailed narrative helps us understand that medieval street food vending was not just about the food itself, but was about hard physical labor, long hours, managing relationships with customers and other vendors, dealing with the unpredictability of daily business, and somehow making enough money to survive and support a family. The vendors who provided medieval junk food were working people doing difficult jobs, and understanding their perspective helps us appreciate the human dimensions of this historical phenomenon. Chapter 12: The Experience of Hunger and Satiation. To conclude our exploration of medieval junk food, let us reflect on the fundamental human experiences of hunger and eating, and how these experiences would have been different in medieval times. The relationship between food, hunger, and satisfaction was quite different in a world where food insecurity was common and where eating was primarily about survival rather than pleasure. Hunger was a much more constant presence in medieval life than it is for most people in modern developed countries. The poor, in particular, would experience genuine hunger regularly, the gnawing, painful sensation of not having eaten enough. Even people who were not starving would often feel hungry as portions were smaller and meals were less calorie-dense than modern meals. The availability of street food provided some relief from this hunger, but it was not a complete solution. The experience of purchasing and eating street food when you were truly hungry would be quite different from the casual snacking that characterizes much modern junk food consumption. You would approach the vendor's stall with real need, and the food you purchased would be intended to address that need rather than simply to satisfy a craving or to provide entertainment. The first bites of a hot pie or a chunk of bread would bring genuine relief, a lessening of the uncomfortable sensation of hunger. However, the food would not provide complete satisfaction in the way that a modern meal might. The portions would be smaller, and the calorie and nutrient content would be lower than what you might hope for. A single pie or a small loaf of bread might take the edge off your hunger, but would not leave you feeling truly full and satisfied. You would eat and then return to work still somewhat hungry, knowing that you would not eat again until the next meal time several hours away. The taste of the food would be less enjoyable than modern food, as we have discussed. The lack of complex flavors, the poor quality of ingredients, and the presence of off flavors from spoilage, poor preparation, would all mean that eating was more about addressing physical need than about experiencing pleasure. You would eat because you needed to, not because you were looking forward to the doint taste. The social context of eating would also be quite different. In modern society, eating is often a social activity done in the company of friends or family, with conversation and interaction forming an important part of the experience. Medieval street food consumption was typically a solitary activity, done quickly while standing or walking, without the social elements that might make it more enjoyable. You would buy your food, eat it alone, and move on, with minimal interaction beyond the brief transaction with the bin vendor. The aftermath of eating street food would also be different from modern experiences. Rather than feeling pleasantly full and satisfied, you might feel heavy and uncomfortable, especially if the food had been greasy or if you had eaten too quickly. You might also feel the first stirrings of digestive upset if the food had been contaminated, though it would take hours before the full symptoms of food poisoning would manifest. You would return to work knowing that you had addressed your immediate hunger, but without any sense of having enjoyed a pleasant experience. The cumulative effect of these differences would be that food in general, and street food in particular, would occupy a very different place in medieval consciousness than it does in modern life. Food was about survival, about maintaining the strength to work, about avoiding the pain of hunger. It was not about pleasure, not about entertainment, not about social bonding in the way that modern meals often are. This different relationship with food shaped how medieval people thought about eating and influenced their behavior around food in ways that would be difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Understanding this helps us recognize that medieval junk food was not really comparable to modern fast food, despite some superficial similarities. The contexts were too different, the purposes were too different, the experiences were too different. Medieval street food was a response to the harsh realities of medieval life, where food insecurity was common, where work was hard and constant, and where convenience was valued not for lifestyle reasons, but because time spent obtaining and preparing food was time taken away from the labor necessary for survival. Chapter 13: Medieval Food Regulations and Enforcement. Before we conclude our exploration, we must examine the regulatory framework that medieval authorities attempted to impose on street food vendors. These regulations reveal much about medieval society's concerns regarding food quality, fair pricing, and public order, and they also reveal the constant tension between regulation and enforcement. The medieval authorities recognized that street food vendors served an important function in feeding urban populations, but they also recognized that these vendors needed to be regulated to prevent fraud, to maintain minimal quality standards, and to protect consumers from the worst abuses. Various laws and ordinances were enacted in different cities and towns throughout medieval Europe, though the specifics varied by location and time period. One of the most comprehensive regulatory systems was found in London, where the city authorities maintained detailed records of regulations and enforcement actions. The rules governing bakers, pie makers, fishmongers, and other food vendors were numerous and specific. Bakers were required to mark their bread with distinctive marks so that loaves could be traced back to their makers if there were complaints about weight or quality. Pie makers were prohibited from including certain types of meat that were considered unwholesome, such as meat from animals that had died of disease. The assize of bread and ale, which we have mentioned previously, set standards for the weight and price of these essential commodities. The assize established a sliding scale that related the price of grain to the price and weight of bread, attempting to ensure that bakers made a reasonable but not excessive profit. Brewers and ale sellers were similarly regulated, with standards for the strength and quality of ale and penalties for those who watered their ale or sold it at excessive prices. Enforcement of these regulations was the responsibility of various officials, including market inspectors, ale tasters, and other appointed or elected individuals. These officials would make periodic inspections of vendors' goods, checking for proper weights and measures, examining food for signs of spoilage or adulteration, and investigating complaints from customers. Vendors who were found to be in violation of the regulations could face various penalties. The penalties for violating food regulations ranged from fines to public shaming to more severe punishments for repeat or egregious offenders. Fines were the most common penalty and would be assessed based on the severity of the violation and the vendor's ability to pay. However, fines alone were not always effective deterrents, especially for vendors who could make more money through fraud than they would lose through occasional fines. Public shaming was another common punishment and took various forms. A vendor who sold underweight bread or watered ale might be placed in the pillory, a wooden frame that locked around the head and hands, forcing the offender to stand in a public place where they would be subjected to the jeers and thrown garbage of passers-by. The offending goods might be displayed alongside the vendor so that everyone could see what crime had been committed. This public humiliation was intended to damage the vendor's reputation and to deter others from similar offenses. For more serious violations such as selling meat from diseased animals or repeatedly cheating customers, the penalties could be more severe. A vendor might be banned from their trade, losing their livelihood. In extreme cases, vendors might face corporal punishment or even execution, though such severe penalties were rare and were typically reserved for offenses that had caused death or serious injury to consumers. The effectiveness of these regulations varied greatly depending on the resources available for enforcement and the political will to pursue violators. In large cities with strong municipal governments and adequate staff of inspectors, enforcement could be reasonably effective, and vendors would know that violations carried real risks. In smaller towns or in places where authorities were corrupt or indifferent, regulations might exist on paper but would be largely ignored in practice. Vendors developed various strategies for evading regulations or for minimizing the consequences of being caught. They might bribe inspectors to overlook violations or to warn them in advance of inspections. They might move from place to place, making it difficult for authorities to track them down. They might use false names or operate through intermediaries. They might reserve their worst quality goods for customers who were unlikely to complain, such as travelers who would be leaving town soon or poor people who had no social standing to support complaints. The constant cat-and-mouse game between regulators and vendors created a dynamic environment where both sides were constantly adapting their strategies. Authorities would develop new rules to address problems they had identified, while vendors would find new ways to circumvent those rules. This ongoing process shaped the evolution of food regulation and enforcement throughout the medieval period and beyond. Modern food safety regulations are vastly more comprehensive and more effectively enforced than their medieval predecessors, but the basic principle remains the same. Society recognizes the need to regulate food vendors to protect consumers. The medieval regulations, crude and inconsistently enforced as they were, represented an early attempt to address this need and laid some of the groundwork for the more sophisticated regulatory systems that would develop in later centuries. Chapter 14. Comparing medieval and modern junk food. As we bring our exploration to a close, let us make some explicit comparisons between medieval junk food and modern fast food, highlighting both the similarities and the profound differences. This comparison will help us appreciate both how much has changed and how some fundamental human needs and behaviors remain constant across the centuries. The similarities are primarily functional. Both medieval street food and modern fast food serve the need for convenient, quick meals that can be obtained without the time and effort required for home cooking. Both are consumed by people who are busy, who are away from home, or who simply prefer not to cook. Both are sold by commercial vendors who are trying to make a profit by providing food at affordable prices. Both are often consumed on the go while walking or traveling, rather than in a sit-down dining setting. However, the differences far outnumber these similarities. The most obvious difference is in food safety and hygiene. Modern fast food, for all its nutritional shortcomings, is prepared and served under sanitary conditions that are monitored by health inspectors. Refrigeration keeps food from spoiling. Workers are required to wash their hands to follow food safety protocols. Restaurants are regularly inspected and can be shut down if they fail to meet health standards. None of this existed in the medieval period, and medieval street food was consequently far more dangerous to consume. The variety and quality of food available is another major difference. Modern fast food comes in an enormous variety of forms, from burgers and fries, to pizza, to tacos, to sushi, to countless other options. The flavors are complex and are carefully engineered to be appealing. The portions are large, often excessively so. Medieval street food was much more limited in variety, much simpler in flavor, and much smaller in portion size. A medieval person transported to a modern fast food restaurant would be overwhelmed by the choices available and would find the food almost unbelievably flavorful and satisfying. The price of food relative to income is also vastly different. A modern person working a minimum wage job can afford to eat fast food regularly, though it may not be the healthiest choice. A medieval laborer needed to think carefully about whether they could afford to purchase street food, as it represented a significant portion of their daily wages. Food in general took up a much larger share of household budgets in medieval times, and even cheap street food was a considerable expense. The speed of service is another difference. Modern fast food is designed to be prepared and served very quickly, with standardized processes and specialized equipment allowing for rapid throughput. Medieval street food could be relatively quick if you were buying something that was already prepared, but if the vendor needed to cook your food to order, you might wait for a considerable time. There were no drive-thrus, no online ordering, no guarantees of how long service would take. The customer experience is also vastly different. Modern fast food restaurants are designed to be clean, comfortable, and inviting, with seating, restrooms, air conditioning, and various amenities. Medieval street food was consumed in dirty, crowded, noisy street environments with no amenities at all. The modern emphasis on customer service, with friendly workers and a focus on customer satisfaction, had no equivalent in medieval street food vending, where the relationship between vendor and customer was often contentious and where both parties were primarily focused on completing the transaction without being cheated. The nutritional profile is another point of comparison. Modern fast food is often criticized for being high in calories, fat, salt, and sugar, and for lacking in nutrients like vitamins and fiber. Medieval street food was also high in salt and often quite fatty, but it was much lower in calories than modern fast food, and sugar was generally not a significant component. The main nutritional problem with medieval street food was not that it provided too many calories, but that it provided too few, and that the quality of the protein and other nutrients might be poor due to the low quality of ingredients. The social meaning of food consumption is perhaps the most profound difference. Modern fast food is often consumed for pleasure, for convenience, for social reasons, rather than out of genuine hunger and need. People might eat fast food when they are not particularly hungry, simply because it tastes good or because it is easy. Medieval street food was consumed primarily because people were genuinely hungry and needed food to continue working. The element of pleasure was secondary to the element of necessity. The modern world has largely solved the problem of food scarcity and food insecurity, at least in wealthy countries. We produce more than enough food to feed everyone, and starvation is rare. The problems we face are different: obesity, diet-related diseases, food waste, and environmental impacts of industrial food production. The medieval world faced the opposite problem. Producing enough food to feed the population was a constant challenge, and hunger was a common experience. These different contexts create fundamentally different relationships with food. Understanding these differences helps us appreciate both how far we have come and what we have lost. We have gained safety, abundance, convenience, and variety. We have lost the direct connection to food production that most medieval people had, the knowledge of where food comes from and how it is made. We have lost the discipline imposed by scarcity, the careful consideration of whether to spend money on food or save it for other needs. We have gained much, but we have also lost something in terms of our relationship with food and our understanding of its true value. As you prepare for sleep tonight, with a full stomach and a comfortable bed, consider the vast gulf that separates your experience from that of a medieval person. The food you ate today was safe, abundant, varied, and probably quite delicious. It required minimal effort on your part to obtain. You did not have to worry about whether it might make you sick or whether you could afford it. These are luxuries that medieval people could not have imagined, and they represent one of the clearest measures of human progress over the past 500 years. The medieval world of junk food is fascinating to study and to imagine, but it is not a world any sane person would want to inhabit. The food was poor, the conditions were filthy, the experience was uncomfortable, and the ever-present threat of hunger and food poisoning made eating a necessity fraught with anxiety rather than a pleasure to be savored. We are extraordinarily fortunate to live in a time and place where food is plentiful, safe, and convenient, even if we sometimes take these blessings for granted. Good night, dear listener. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams sweet. May you wake tomorrow refreshed and ready to enjoy the abundance of the modern world, secure in the knowledge that you will never need to purchase a questionable pie from a medieval street vendor or risk food poisoning from improperly stored meat. The medieval pine world and its junk food are safely behind us, preserved only in historical records and in boring sleep stories like this one. Sleep well and good night.